Thank you all for coming. Thank you, the Humanities Festival, for having us. I'm Neil Steinberg. I'm a columnist with the Sun-Times. We only have 45 minutes or so to talk about this extraordinary book. So I'm going to keep my introduction of you to, I assume you all know Adam Gopnik, the New Yorker's 25 years on staff, writing just deeply thoughtful, wonderfully lapidary. Usually my experience is you're reading a piece and you hit some sort of completely beautiful phrase and you say, who wrote this? And then you go to find, and of course, it's him, the New Yorker's man in Paris for 5 years, and then he wrote his wonderful Paris to the Moon, which introduced him to the wider world. And I could spend the entire time just praising that and talking about what he did in that book, sort of scrapping the whole Hemingway beret myth that had gone on for 70 years and actually looking at what's in front of him. And I think that's my favorite thing about what you do and what this book does, is that he sees, you see the things that are for you see details. There's a line in Paris to the Moon where you're seeing a circus, the Moreno Borman family circus. And he says they're a true family circus in that whenever one of them does anything at all difficult, the others all gather at the edge and they hold hands and they whisper, careful, careful, right? And I just love that so much. So it's a huge honor for me to be here, and we're going to just sort of chat about this book. But if you have questions or so, to 15 minutes before the end, we're going to have microphones and have you stand up and come up to the mics, and you can ask any questions that you want of Adam. The thing which I really admired about this book, people are describing it as a history of restaurants, but it's really about what the consumption of food means in our lives. You talk about the twin pillars of the cookbook and the restaurant. And of the pleasures that we have, food is sort of moving from a personal physical pleasure onto almost like an art, like music, and talk about that a little bit. Is that a modern development? I mean, you trace the restaurants back to revolutionary times.
French Revolution. Absolutely. Just before I go, I must say, Neil has a new book out called You Were Never in Chicago.
Log rolling.
And we had a Maupassant-like moment because his publisher sent it to me 6 months ago, and I loved it, and I wrote Neil back on the wrong email. This is like, if Guy de Maupassant were living now, he'd be writing a short story called The Wrong Email.
But my life would have fallen apart then, and it didn't, because I've known Adam for a dozen years since, and you don't want to demand too much of your friends. So
that was the unfortunate part. The fortunate part is I can now say without redundancy to you today what a wonderful book this is about the city, and in a weird way, not unrelated to the kind of stuff I'm trying to write about France and Paris in this book and in Paris to the Moon, because it's about having an image of a place in your head and then trying to compare the image with the reality that you find.
And also incorporating your family. Maybe we should start here. Your family.
No, I'll answer your question.
Okay, well, let's reserve the family part, because I do the same thing you do.
Sort of what's behind this book is I'm an incredibly greedy guy. I love to eat and I love to cook, but my liking to cook is more pendant on my loving to eat than it is on any impulse towards generosity or caring of any kind. And the funny thing about eating is that it's one of the two things that are obligatory in our lives. It's one of our animal nature. We breathe and we eat. There are some other parts of our animal nature that we love but are optional, unfortunately.
You couldn't have written a book about having sex like this.
No,
you mentioned sex.
You can mention sex, and eating is part of having sex, but as
he said, the restaurants are a prelude to seduction, and
exactly.
he touches upon that a bit.
Well, this is true, but the point is that eating is an obligatory thing, and yet it's the one thing in our life. The only other obligatory thing we have is breathing, right? And breathing is not something we ritualize very much. In other words, when you go to visit your wife's family, they don't say, well, here, it's funny because we only breathe through our right nostril on Fridays. And
that might be coming.
Yes. Elaborate rituals of breathing tend to be, yoga aside, tend to be unusual. Every single human group of any kind of whom we have any knowledge has a highly ritualized approach to eating. Rules about what's edible, rules about what's not. Rules about when festivals fall and what you eat, rules about who cooks when, rules about what you serve at a rite of passage or at a funeral. Eating is simultaneously the most animal side of our nature, the most compulsory, the most tied to all of our appetites that are implanted in us by our genes, and at the same time, it's the most ritualized, it's the most ornamental, the most cultural, the most optional side of our nature, the one thing that we give the most embroidery to, but it's also the one thing that in a sense is the deepest root we put into the ground of the planet. And that's what I wanted to write about in this book. How can that be possible? How is it that there's something that's simultaneously so automatic and so much a function of animal appetite that at the same time is so endlessly altering and that changes all the time? Why is it that, given that our hunger never alters, our tastes change all the time? So that's the subject of the book, really.
Is it all status? Because you bring out all, it's sort of a most food writers would just sort of celebrate restaurants and celebrate food and talk about all this wonderful experiences he's had all over the world. But Adam stops and he sort of says, now, am I lost? What's the beautiful phrase, the fog of the current epoch? I think. Yeah, I believe
nice.
It's a beautiful. It's a tremendous. The fog of our own epoch is the phrase he uses, because he talks about how if you go 100 years ago, what would a gourmand do? Oh, these are strawberries that were brought over on ice, from the. So they're looking for food from far away and exotic spices from the Far East. And now, of course, every Costco has big stacks of all that. So what are we doing is we're having these local, and Adam has a very funny, it's almost a Woody Allen-like segment where you're looking for a chicken that's raised in New York. And I
decided that we would try, because I'm sure all of you here know that locavorism is the kind of the hottest thing in the food world. And it's easy to do, to eat in a 100-mile food shed if you're living in Berkeley, or then that's no accomplishment, right? You're in Northern California. So I had the idea, let's eat for a week just things that were raised or grown within the 5 boroughs of New York City. And that was going to be our rule. So the kids immediately, I have 2 children, Luke and Olivia, and they immediately ruled out pigeons and squirrels as possible sources of protein. Despite my saying, squab is a great delicacy, and what could be finer than Brunswick stew? But anything, not only could we not eat squirrel or pigeon, but anything that looked as though it might once have been squirrel or pigeon was ruled out. No brown food was allowed on the plate. I found out that actually it wasn't that difficult to get wonderful vegetables in New York, because there are several farms that still exist in Brooklyn and Staten Island. The farm in Brooklyn, the guy told me that the eggplants and so on are still cultivated with manure taken from the elephants at the Bronx Zoo. And as he told it to me, I was sure it was like, go wash the mimeograph paper, right? It was the thing you said to this, to the city bureau. Oh yeah, no, we use elephant dung for these eggplants, but it turns out to be true. So the vegetables were easy to get, but how are you going to get protein? And I only could find 2 sources. One was a mad scientist at Brooklyn College who raises tilapia in the basement, kind of mutant tilapia, because he's a visionary. He thinks that's the only way we're going to have protein in the coming century is if we have these giant vats of tilapia the size of the Sears Tower outside every city, and we'll just go and reach in at the end of the day and everyone will take their tilapia home with them, because there's no other way to get sufficient protein to feed the billions. So there was the tilapia that I had, and then I had the idea of getting a chicken. And so I approached, there are egg kind of cooperatives in New York in these lovely little gardens, and so I tried to get one of the the laying hen guys to whack a chicken for me.
That's the Woody Allen line. Is he's in sunglasses and it's sort of like a drug buy, and he actually says, "So you got the chicken?"
Right? And the guy, it was like a scene from The Sopranos, because I was saying, "You ready to do it?" And he said, "I don't think we should do it. Don't want to do it."
And this is like a spoiler alert, so if you haven't read the book, you may want to cover your ears and hum, but the kicker for me is that the guy's like, "What, you're going to kill it?"
No, he thought I wanted the chicken for legitimate reasons to take it home. Well, I had to bring home a chicken, so we went driving, and it turns out that, and I'm sure this is true in Chicago, right? There is one kind of remaining great slaughterhouse, kind of beautiful, chic, wonderful slaughterhouse in the Bronx called Musa's, because for a lot of recently arrived immigrants, it's terribly important to have freshly killed kid and so on. So we found this place, and sure enough, they had chickens. And it was strange, because you'd think it'd be off-putting, but my grandfather was a butcher in Philadelphia. And so in a weird way, the smell and the feeling of a slaughterhouse put me back in a kind of nursery mood from when I was a little boy and visiting my grandfather. And they killed us a chicken just like that. Unfortunately, it was a Pennsylvania-grown chicken. Right. But my feeling was that, after all, it had come from out of town. It had lived in unreasonably close quarters with total strangers, and it had been murdered by another total stranger. That
so that's
made it
a very
New Yorker.
Manhattan kind
That's
of chicken.
That's a New York chicken. So we brought it home, and I cooked it that night.
And the kids seem to like it. The one thing I want to make sure we get to is, and an issue that comes up in your book a lot, is food as comfort versus food as challenge. And I couldn't really see, I'm a guy who I can eat at the same restaurant 50, 100, 200 times, and I order the same meal because it's what I like. And if I get something else that's off the menu trying to be experimental, I don't like it as much as the thing I always get. From the book, you seem like a guy who is constantly going to Spain to challenge yourself with all these different exotic things. How much is the balance in your real life to adventure to comfort? Can you?
Well, that's a nice question. You know, on the whole, I mean, all literature, all nonfiction is inherently fictional, right? Because it's so selective. So in the book, you have the impression, that son of a bitch, he's like going off to Spain to eat at El Bulli, and he's going to the White House kitchens. And the truth is, as you know, as a journalist, you do that twice.
Right.
That's 3 days of the year, right? And all the other days, you know, you're sitting there and say, do you feel like chicken or fish tonight, right?
It's like no one goes to the bathroom in Casablanca, right?
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
you leave those parts out.
So I did get to do it. My feeling is that I have that horrible habit, you know, chicken or fish tonight, which I'm sure every home cook has, who sort of is when the kids are leaving for school at 7:45 in the morning, say, what do you feel like for dinner tonight? And you never get a look of such resentment and hatred from your children as when you bring up what you feel like for dinner.
Because it's your job as a parent to have that ready.
Yeah. Right, when they come back. I, on the whole, and it's one of the themes of the book, I think, is for me, one of the problems with a lot of food writing now, and a lot of food, is that it points all the vectors, brings all your attention to what's on the plate. And the great joy of eating for me, great joy of restaurant going is, there's a moment that sort of magically occurs when somehow everything levitates, when it's a combination of wonderful food, the right place, alcohol, the appropriate partner, caffeine, and suddenly your conversation has never seemed so scintillating, life has never looked so good. And that's the moment, and it's something that, you know, you feel in Paris strongly at a wonderful meal. That's the moment, that's the thing that we search out, that's the epiphany of eating that we want. And very often in ambitious restaurants, fancy restaurants, you have the feeling that instead of that feeling, instead everything is thrusting your attention at the food. You know, you've been to those places, you know, we have a tasting of 4 kinds of salt. There's black volcanic salt, orange Himalayan salt, pink salt from the Hawaiian Islands, and finally, what we like to think of as Jewish salt.
You call them as foams and powders and things.
And salt tastes very much like salt, even if you don't. Now, and so you feel, and you can't have a conversation, you can't do anything because you're in sort of a salt space, right? With other people. And I never care for that, right? And I like it. Now, having said that, I will say that there's another side of sort of molecular cuisine and all of that. And I think that Grant Schatz's place here is the best I've ever been for that kind of thing. But you know, actually, I didn't put this in the book, I don't think. I went to his place, to Olivia, when I was in Chicago, and I had nobody to go to dinner with me. You know, I was all alone. All my friends had turned me down.
Not all.
I should have. I had my little John D. McDonald mystery or something, and I said, all right, I'll go do this. And it was fabulous. It was fantastic. And I realized it was in part because the ideal way to eat food of that kind of artistic complication, elaboration, is by yourself, because you're in dialogue. The conversation you're having is with the chef, in effect.
But isn't it like going to a museum by yourself, that it's never quite as good if you can't turn and go, look at this, and share it? I mean, sharing it is really...
Sharing it is crucial, but for that kind of food, it was like I got to go to El Bulli. I'm sure some of you have heard of this legendary Spanish... Well, exactly. I went just before it closed. I got to go for one of the last meals at El Bulli with a woman who had been in residence there for a while. And what struck me about it is very often when you have that kind of food in America, partly because it's tied into expense account dining, and partly because Americans can be moralistic about anything, including pleasure. If you go to that kind of place, especially pleasure, if you go to that kind of place in America, it's churchy, and you feel the churchiness of it. In Spain, it's a circus, and it's treated as a circus. It's meant to kind of wow you. It's meant to make you laugh. The puns that are made with food.
Well, there was a scene, and I wanted to ask you about it, because it's the one moment where I kind of pulled back and I thought, oh, what's happened to Adam here? You're in, I'm going to say it wrong, Cellar de Can Roca.
Yes, the Roca Brothers restaurant.
Roca Brothers,
right.
and you asked for their dream dessert. And they says, well, we have a dessert that's made for this soccer star, Messi. And it comes out, and they have like artificial grass, and it's an MP3 player, and there's a goal. You can hear the announcer from the soccer match, and in my mind, it sort of kicks a little chocolate ball into your mouth. I kept waiting for you to turn to the reader and kind of go, and you never do. You play it very seriously, and I couldn't decide.
Well, you know why? Because the thing is, this was insane, because it was an attempt to reproduce the experience that Lionel Messi has when he scores a goal for Barcelona on your plate. And you do, because it's, as Neil was saying, you have a kind of a half of a soccer ball covered with artificial turf that's been painted with the perfume of grass. So you put your face into it, you're on the grass, the waiter turns on a little MP3, and you hear, even if you don't understand Catalan like me, you see that it's Messi approaching and go, Messi, Messi, oh, Messi! And he's approaching, and you eat one little white chocolate soccer ball. And then Messi is alone at goal, and you eat the second one. And then you hear, goal, Messi! And you eat the third one, and the whole thing flips over, and it breaks through the goal netting that's made of spun sugar on the left side of this thing, and this geyser of mango mousse shoots directly into your face at the very moment that says it. But what was so sweet about it, maybe I didn't convey it well, is that the younger brother, who most people consider to be the great genius of desserts.
He's sort of hovering and watching.
He's hovering and watching, so you have that. But also, he didn't say, let me show you our great messy dessert. He said, he's like an artist. He said, there's something I've been working on that's kind of has many elements to it. Could I try it on you? So, it had that quality of genuine artistic invention, because he had the insecurity of an artist. Will this work or not? And as I say, it's not something, as I said when I got home and the kids and my wife were saying, well, what was it like? I said, well, you could have the same effect if you eat a creamsicle in front of the television, right? While the Bears are playing. But you wouldn't want to do it at home. But it was an attempt to make a food something as elaborate in time and sort of dimensions as in any art form. And there was something very moving about that.
I mean, in a sense, eating, it's the most ephemeral of art forms, right? Because you can't save it as much, writing about it. You have a wonderful thing where you talk about cookbooks and you compare them to the home version of game shows. It's one of those tremendous juxtapositions that Adam does, where he basically says you get the home version of Jeopardy and you play it, but it's not the real Jeopardy. No. It's sort of this, it's like sucking stones in the desert instead of water or whatever. And so, maybe it's the anhedonistic American in me, but sometimes when I read that part, I'm thinking, oh, this is lark's tongues. Okay, this is like the Romans basically wanting to have whatever is the hardest thing to do. And so we're saying it's art because what we really want to do is we want to spend a lot of money on it, and we want people to see us sort of doing that. Does that, I mean, I don't want to be, does that hover in the back? I mean, I think you address it nicely by yourself, but I want to hear your comment on that.
Sure, look, food serves 1,000 symbolic functions in our life. And one of the symbolic functions it serves is a classic status symbol. That's one of the things it does. And spending more on food. It's one of my favorite places in New York is there's an extraordinarily expensive cafe run by my friend Eli Zabar called the AT Cafe on Madison Avenue, where you can get a cappuccino for $12. And across the street, you can get the same cappuccino at the Vian, the Greek coffee shop, for $2. The line is for the $12 cappuccino, right?
Right.
There's a professor of economics here in Chicago, Gary Becker, who's written about this. Actually, why should this be so, right? Why do people line up? You have two restaurants serving comparable kinds of Italian food. There's a line outside one, and there's no line outside the other, right? And yet the normal thing in economics would be that you'd lower the prices in the one without the line, and you'd raise the prices in the one with the line. But that never happens in food. And what he's saying is you're paying for the line. You're paying for the line.
It's very true.
You're paying to stand in the line. So, and I think that's true. And so food plays its role as a status symbol, and you can't eliminate that. That's one of its functions in our lives. The question is, I think that we all enjoy that. this is going to be a deep thought in proportion, right? In the right place in our lives. I don't think we can avoid it. My favorite place to think about that way is probably the most, I think it's even won awards as the best restaurant in the world. It's a place called Noma in Copenhagen, which just is devoted to, great chef Rennie Redzak, who just is devoted to things you can find in Scandinavia in the winter. So one of the things he does, for instance, and I've had this, not at his place, he came to New York once, are storage carrots, old carrots, vintage carrots. So he said, oh, this is the 2007 carrot, right? And these carrots get covered as old carrots. They're old carrots. Right. That's what they are. They're very old carrots that your mother and my mother would have thrown out, right? So you can't, like the potatoes that used to sit at the bottom of the cupboard, of the closet, right? That would get those long tubers coming out of them. And your mom would say, why didn't you throw these out when I told you to throw them out? He cooks those potatoes with the tubers coming out of them. And, he braises them and so on. So he does those carrots. He does only things you can find in Denmark, and you have to travel to Copenhagen to eat his food, right? Now, clearly, it's a great place, but it's also clear that being able to say, I ate at Noma means I had the money to go to Copenhagen, right. I had the taste to do, to understand something that would seem to the ordinary not to be there. So yes, of course, those things are geared into it. I think that we try and make a distinction always between lark's tongues, between things that seem to us merely excess and unorganized excess, and things that seem to us beautifully ornamental. You distinguish between great Rococo architecture, which is simply an overabundance of beauty, and kitsch, which is simply an absence of organization. And I think that that's the sort of judgment you have to make over and over when you're judging the art form of cooking or any other. My own tastes, I should say, run towards penne matriciana and lemon tart, but I recognize that there's something going on in that other kind of thing that genuinely has within it. What is art, after all? It's a desire to take something ordinary, a color or a taste or something else, and surprise us with it, make us see it in a way we hadn't before. And that genuine artistic impulse is, I think, latent in that kind of cooking.
One thing I wanted to make sure to talk about, this seemed to, for some reason, critics leave it alone, I think because it's so unusual, is Elizabeth Pennell. Mm-hmm. Okay, there's a love story wrapped in this book, and it happens to be a love story with a woman who died 100 years ago or 90 years ago. Elizabeth Pennell, he calls her a rare astonishment. She's a food writer from the turn of the Belle Epoque century, from the 1890s or so, and you call her someone genuinely out of time. She starts this book saying, the opening sentence of her book is, "Gluttony is ranked among the deadly sins. It should be honored among the cardinal virtues." And you're obviously in love with it. I wondered how Martha felt about it, but tell me, it was a bold decision. What's her place in that book? You're trying to point out, I think almost it goes current to what we're talking about, the mists and the foams and things, because she was someone who was appreciating food, but also in a very kind of earthy way that was unusual back then for women.
Absolutely. Elizabeth Pennell was an American-born writer who lived most of her life in London as part of the Whistler Wild Circle. And in the course of reporting this book, I came upon this amazing book she wrote called Diary of a Greedy Woman, exactly from 1900. And it was a collection of all of her pieces about food. And she claimed, just as in the sentence you just read there, most of the kind of writing about food from that period by women has to have a kind of patina of housekeeping, of good housekeeping in it. This is, I'm a good domestic provider. And she just writes about her appetite in this wonderfully sensual way, sort of Nigella Lawson 100 years earlier. And I just was totally turned on by this greedy woman. And I thought there was a funny kind of irony, because she was a woman who loved food, who was taking on what was in her culture essentially a masculine role. Right. She travels, she goes to Italy. It's a wonderful chapter where she talks about this exotic new thing called spaghetti, and she explains to you how to eat and cook spaghetti. And there she is claiming this role. And here I am, a man, writer, collecting my pieces 100 years later, who in a certain sense is taking on what is in our culture a feminine role. I'm a cook. I do all the cooking for our family, and I'm the guy who says, what do you want, chicken or fish tonight? As the kids get to the elevator. New York, very New York scene. Right. And so I thought it'd be fun to kind of write her letters or more appropriately, emails, because
yeah.
emails are the form of our time, and also if you're going to write to the dead, you should write to them in an appropriately ethereal form, like an email. Because who knows, they might answer, right? The email I sent you that got misdirected could be going up to heaven, right? And that could be a lost email service someplace behind the pearly gates. They have a spam filter in the whole thing that the devil runs.
No swearing. Yeah.
And I thought this would be fun to do, to write to her in this way. Martha, I think, one of the things as a man long married, with all the other activities become optional and food becomes central. I always tease her by saying, the truth is when we were first married, and we've been married a long time, I read out loud every sentence I wrote to her first. And then after a certain amount of time, she would read the manuscript of everything I wrote before it ever went into print. Then she would read the galleys of everything I wrote before it appeared in the magazine. Now, if she's at the dermatologist and she sees an old New Yorker on the table, she'll pick it up and leaf through it to see if I've written something. But that's about as, she hates when I say that, because the truth is...
So she wasn't jealous, she wasn't
she wasn't jealous, and she understands that, that it's all made up anyway. The rule, I don't know what the rule is in your family, Neil, about, I once said, look, the only rule I want in this house is no piercings below the navel and no bitter memoirs. Nobody can write a bitter memoir.
I don't know.
Right away, all three members of my family, my 2 kids and my wife, I totally explained that they not only were going to, they already had written the bitter memoir.
See, that's why you can't, you have to, with me, whenever we're watching football, I'll say to my younger son, I'll say, look at the tats on that play. I'd love to have that. Well, let's go, as soon as you turn 18, we'll get some dad and lad tattoos that'll, and then of course he shrinks in horror. Is the
idea that you're being engaged in it. Well, it turns out my daughter's bitter memoir was called The Other Side of the Gate, because I wrote that book Through the Children's Gate, so she's written The Other Side of the Gate. And Luke, my son, I wrote a book called Angels and Ages, and his is called Ages and Ages, my wife and my father. And Martha's, my wife's bitter memoir, is called And He's Not Even Really Canadian.
You're not, born in Philadelphia.
I'm born in Philly, and I'm...
Masquerading as a Canadian, who would do that?
Can you imagine a shabbier impersonation than pretending to be a
Canadian?
It's truly appalling. But in Canada, everybody says, "Oh, we're so proud of you're Canadian."
You don't have to hurt to tell them that's an act of kindness, is what that is.
So I write all these emails to Elizabeth Pennell, right? And I'm deeply enjoying this because it gives you a lot, and it also gives continuity to a book. One of the struggles with the kinds of books I write is all of my books have begun with essays from the New Yorker, but publishers hate the C word. It's a collection, so it's not a collection. And also, you want the readers. Books are very different than magazine pieces, and they're different in a peculiar way. In a surprising way. A magazine piece, in some sense, is always a public statement, right? Because it's in a public forum. A magazine is like that. You're singing in a choir with Malcolm Gladwell to your right and somebody who's on the battlefield in Iraq to your left and David Remnick hovering abominably above you. And to some degree, you're singing in public, right? A book is a much more intimate form of address. And when you make a book work, it's because it has a more intimate form of address. A book is something you take into bed with you. It's something you take to the bathroom with you. It's something you live with.
For us, that could be changing. We should probably talk about that.
Yes, it should. Yeah, we should talk about that. But traditionally, in my idea, and I think for readers now, people who care for books, the book has an intimate address. And so one of the jobs in doing this book was to begin with the essays and the subjects I had, but to make it more intimate in address. And there was no better way of doing it than have intimately addressing a mysterious woman. Can I give away the punchline of this thing? It's I guess my own...
yeah, I was thinking, I know exactly where you're going. Go ahead, please.
So I'm writing this, and have that dangerously complacent half smile of, oh, this is amusing stuff that you get on your face as you're writing away. This will keep them laughing. And I go on, I do the one thing you should never do, which is to go on researching. You should, when you leave the library...
It's a spoiler alert, too, so if you haven't read the book, you're going to cover your home.
I went on reading, and then I discovered that Elizabeth Pennell, this wonderful, sensual writer, had been born in Philadelphia, as I was. And she had written a book about Philadelphia. I thought, oh, I've got to read this. So I go to the New York Public Library and 42nd Street, so this will just enrich it. Turns out she was a violent, and I mean violent, anti-Semite. And the form her anti-Semitism took was going back to Philadelphia in the teens of the last century and being sickened and appalled because the beautiful tree-named streets of Philadelphia, locust, spruce, pine, had been invaded by Russian Jews. I come from a family of Philadelphia Russian Jews who lived on Locust Street.
Not only a general anti-Semite, but an anti-Semite
Hated my
heaping
family.
scorn on his ancestors specifically,
Yes.
which is sort of a box that I was reading this. It really gives a lot of spice to the
Not
end.
just hated the Jews, but hated my relatives.
Your Bubby and Zadie.
And let me add, hating my relatives is not in itself an incomprehensible activity. But it was why she hated them, not for the reasons you might have.
She didn't have reason the way you do.
That's right. So I walk out of the New York Public Library in that kind of Robert De Niro fugue state, where you're walking down with your mouth open and your eyes brow furrowed, and thought, what can I do about this? What can I do about this? And I genuinely thought, for a moment, well, I'm just going to have to scrap this whole continuity, the whole thing I found to give the book unity. And then I thought, and obviously I was just being cravenly opportunistic in doing this, but I invented a rationale that I do think is persuasive, and I hope I make persuasive in the book. And that is, there was the core question that the book presents, right? We say food is ritual, food is ornament, food is pleasure, food is the social glue that brings us all together. And we all know how true that is, right? How many times in your life with your relatives, right, when the one social glue that will make things work is sharing a meal. And you know it as a traveler. We all know it as travelers. People who travel in much more dangerous places than I travel in will tell you that the moment when they say, come in and eat with us, is the moment when you're not going to end up as a tiny shrunken head sometime later. Crucial human thing. But the other side of that is, who don't you eat with? Who don't you eat with? Because it strikes us, with whom do you not feel you share enough commonality, enough possibility of a common humanity, that you'd say, I don't want to be at your table. I say in the book, and it's true, I only had that experience retrospectively once when I was living in Paris. And we had dear friends, wonderful people. Alexander Mosley, alas, who's passed away now, writer, his wife Charlotte, terrific, dear, smart, good people. And he was the son of Oswald Mosley, the British fascist leader. And he invited us to dinner with his mother, Diana Mitford, who I was fascinated by, because Nancy Mitford, her sister's one of my favorite writers. But I didn't have a clear sense of exactly what the Mosleys had done in the 1930s. Maybe I didn't want to know. And we had dinner together. I sort of regret that I did it. It sort of said, okay, that's forgiven.
Bygones be bygones.
Let bygones, and some bygones can never be bygones, right? So would you sit down with Elizabeth Pennell? So I struggled through that at the end of the book. And I wanted to do that because, as you know, the book begins, maybe to its own commercial doom, with a really dark moment in the history of eating. It's a moment, the first thing in the book is a letter by a French resistor who's going to be shot, going to be killed by the Nazis within an hour. It's the last letter he writes to his parents. And in it, he talks about all the wonderful meals they've shared. Right. And the last line of the letter is, as you can see, questions of food have taken on great importance. Right. And that's the question. Why would questions of food take on great importance for a Frenchman? Yes, he's a Frenchman, true. But
what makes that perfect, it's not a question of status. He's not showing off to his parents. Exactly. It's a question of the deepest happy memories he has that he's thinking at the time of death. I mean, it really helps sort of inoculate you for some of all the other discussions that come.
So coming full circle, I wanted to say, okay, that was what Jacques de Coeur, the guy who wrote the letter, was concerned about. So how does that come around full circle with Elizabeth Pennell and her anti-Semitism? So it was an attempt to situate the book, which I hope is essentially a romp about whacking chickens and all of that. But I hope to situate it a little bit in real questions about who do we share life in common with.
I have a facial line. I always use someone who likes Wagner and Nietzsche and these huge anti-Semites. I always say if I was only going to enjoy artists who weren't anti-Semites, I'd be in a room with a klezmer band going and Chagall on the wall. But you narrow your world very much and time is running. We're almost time for questions. And the final, since there's so much of this is about also memory as well in a very Proustian way, although you never bring up Proust, which I admire. You're a very cute reader. Yes, I deliberately did. Of course you didn't, because that's the obvious thing. And good writing, I think we both agree with this, is you don't want to tell people obvious stuff. And in my book about Chicago, there's nothing about the Cubs or Ivy or things you know about. But looking to the future, this is being taped. There's going to be some 22nd century Elizabeth Pennell who's going to discover your works and fall, of course, in love with you. And you
could she start now?
Well, it's got 300 people here. Adam, go for it. You talk about, the faint twitters of posterity, which is another great Gopnik line where you can almost start to hear people laughing at us, but also respecting us. What do you think when she looks at your work is going to stand out? Is this just food fashion that you're talking about? What's the essential aspect to it that's going to remain?
When I started the book, it's a hard question to answer, but let me try. When I started this book, I said to my editor, I'd like to call it The Table Comes First, because this was a line that comes from a wonderful British chef named Fergus Henderson, who's right on the day of the 7/7, the London bombings, we were together, both in no mood to eat. And yet he said, I never understand how a young couple starting off in life can buy a sofa or a television or a bed. Don't they know the table comes first? I thought, it's beautiful, the table comes first. So I wanted to call the book The Table Comes First, A New Physiology of Taste. Because the great book, from my mind, the greatest book ever written about food was by brims, a Frenchman in the revolutionary period, called A Physiology of Taste. My editor quickly disabused me of the idea that we were going to publish a book called A New Physiology of Taste. But that's what I wanted to be. And what's that great book by brims about? It's about food, and wonderfully so. It's about eating and its pleasures. But it's really about the beauty and necessity of what we now call soft power. It's about how the things that are not barbed and edged and obviously masculine and virile and tough nonetheless have more power, not only in our lives, but in making our civilizations than anything else. So I hope 100 years from now, someone will look back on that and say, there were lots of things that were wrong about their civilization, but their appreciation of the symbolic and soft power role of food was something that was admirable about it. Not necessarily through my megaphone, but
you were part of the trend where if for millennia we had gender roles where you were a woman, you did this, and you were a man, you did that now we've realized that you get to do what you want.
Yes.
And whatever your gender is.
The other thing I think that I would hope and believe and pray and fantasize that someone might remember about this book is that it contains the secret of life.
I wrote that down.
Not many books contain the secret of life.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have like enough questions for 10 hours. And so but the secret of life is, rightly so, is having enough intellectual detachment from our tastes to see their absurdity, while taking enough emotional fulfillment from them to grasp their necessity.
Yeah, I was talking about food, but I think it's true about everything. You and I both love writing about parenting, about being a father. And the key thing about parenting is you simultaneously know that it's absurd. It's absurd in the sense that nobody does it well, and in some weird way, nobody does it badly. I mean, they do when they abuse and beat,
right.
But that it's different. The degree of obsessiveness that we give to it is not in accordance with the degree of the consequences it's necessarily going to have. And also, we all know that all of our children are essentially alike, right? They start talking at 2. I mean, if we're lucky and everything goes normal, they start talking at 2. They come to hate us at 13. They go off to college at 18. They come back in their 30s to apologize and say you weren't so bad. Our kids are interchangeable. Your 2 guys and my 2 guys. Essentially, we could swap around. We never could do it, right? We have to grant the absurdity of our attachment to these particular people, unchangeable for any others. And at the same time, we have to grant. Some people stop there and they say, "Oh my God, people who obsess about their kids." The late George Carlin, wonderful comedian, right? But I always sort of thought he was kind of crazy. These goddamn kids, people talking about their kids. All kids are the same. That's true, right? But you also have to go to the next step and grant the emotional necessity and authority of that.
Part of the challenge being a writer who writes about their children, I think, is you want to make them seem as extraordinary to other people as they're extraordinary to you. Otherwise, you're bragging about the commonplace, and you do that. I mean, Paris to the Moon, the love scene that you have with Luke having cocoa at the Ritz with this little girl. It's just he's not my kid, and yet it's so extraordinarily touching.
But as look, this is the alchemy of literature, is at least the kind of semi-literature I attempt, is that the eyes either become used or they don't. And you're writing along and you're trying to be as simultaneously as authentic and as elaborately artificial about your experience as you can be, keeping those 2 things in some balance. And then, I know we need to go, and then but you do it, and then sometimes those eyes become used. You do something like going to have Coke with the Ritz, and people come to you and say, "That's my favorite thing because I felt like that." And then you do another thing that's like, and then I did this. And everyone goes, oh, Jesus, God,
Oh,
you
weird,
did that?
yes.
You did that? I can't imagine. And you don't know, and you never know. And there's the alchemy of writing in which the I you enter becomes the you that's felt, is the reason it matters, and is the reason it's almost impossible to do.
On that note, we have to turn to questions, and thank you for being such a good audience. Not the clean finish we would have had 5 minutes ago, but and there are microphones you need to go to, so go to the microphones and ask away. Try not to make them speeches about yourself, but questions. So we'll stipulate that Adam and I both admire you and that, but let's focus on questions.
Yes, that's the difference between an author and an audience. The author makes his I's into U's, the audience makes their U's into I's.
Right. Unless there are no questions, we can talk for 10 more minutes.
No, this got to be. The first question.
Well, I'll ask you the Greek. Let's talk about the New Yorker. Fascinating for people. It's something which has changed over time. For a while, I remember when having photographs in the New Yorker was just blasphemy, and it seemed that Tina Brown had come in and she was doing this crass thing. But it all works, and the magazines do in an era where magazines are not always doing so well. Newsweek, I'm sure you've heard, has announced it's ceasing publication, but the New Yorker's doing well and strong.
Yeah, look, my friend Malcolm Gladwell, who's always immensely shrewd guy, immensely smart guy, once pointed out, people say, oh, literature is declining, the audience, and yada, yada. We have 1 million subscribers, right? So we have, let's say, 2 million readers, or 1.5 million readers, and 500,000 people look at the cartoons. Only, right? I am not among them, by the way. I always say you can either write for the New Yorker or read the New Yorker, but no one can expect you to do both.
Life's too short.
Life is too short to do both. So I am one of those people when someone comes up to me and says, "Did you read that thing that Seymour Hersh?" Yeah, no, I'm going to look at that. Definitely want to read that. There is an appetite for whatever you want to call. I hate that phrase, long form writing, but there's an appetite for literature. There's an appetite for writing that's out there and that exists. It isn't a majority appetite. It isn't, by the standards of our entertainment industry, a mass appetite even. But it's a real appetite. 1 million subscribers is 4 times the size of Shakespeare's London. It's whatever, 10 times the size of Periclean Athens. It's a lot of people, right? You'll never meet 1 million people in your life, though sometimes I feel that I have on the course of a book tour. And so I think that appetite is very real, and I think that we continue to serve it. How we're going to continue to serve it is a problem, a knotty problem that we struggle with every day. I believe that as all of journalism migrates onto tablets and other things, I don't think that's necessarily a loss. We now have a lively online thing as well. We have blogs. I love it. I write a Jets blog, New York Jets blog. I write a Montreal Canadiens blog. I get the thing is you have commenters now, and the people from Boston hate my Montreal Canadiens blog. But it's fun. It's nice, you can do quick things. When I did a piece about Paul Ryan and abortion.
How does that affect someone that's so thoughtful? I mean, they have us tweeting from the paper, and I'm sitting here watching the debates, putting out these unfiltered thoughts, and I'm thinking, is this what I've become? I mean, we always talk about how the electronic form affects the reader and the form you read it in, but as the writer, I'll never forget that Forbes.com assigned me something on baseball goats. And my first thought was, oh, baseball, I better be really careful because everyone knows about baseball, and if I make one mistake, it will come in. And then I'll fix it online because it's, and then you know what I'm saying. So to me, it has a certain laxity to it. Speed and thoroughness are enemies in a way. So do you find yourself as someone who obviously spends so much time on your craft as we hurtle towards the immediacy of the computer age, the internet, I use the phrase computer age, I'll have to look that down, of the internet, is that affecting your work, and is that in a good or bad way?
I hope not. Look, I love a well-worked sentence. I love a pregnant sentence the way I love looking at a pregnant woman. I just think there's nothing more satisfying in the world than a perfectly balanced aphoristic sentence that has idiom and obscurity and wit and point married in it. And those sentences take an enormous amount of work. They're just hard to, they're labor. And sometimes they're luck. They're a combination of labor and luck. So you have to weigh the pleasure of actually speaking to something that people are talking about now. The New Yorker is a funny place, to come back to your question, because we have a tradition of a literary tradition, but it has all the exigencies of a weekly magazine. We're writing about the world as it's passing in front of our eyes right now. And when I first started at the magazine, you could make a case back in the Sean era that we had a superbly literary cast, but we had neglected a little bit our duties to the passing scene. And then Tina came in and redirected us towards the passing scene. And now David Remnick, I think he's done about as brilliant and as sensitive a job to getting that alchemy again of writing and journalism in the right balance.
But we have access. I mean, I have the New Yorker on CD, which probably dates me, on compact disc.
The archive
can go back to 1925, right. And I do if I'm researching something. I'll see articles that were written. The title of my book is from an A.J. Liebling piece from 1952. Do you think that the tweets and things, the postings we're doing, are people going to be referring to them in fit? Are they significant?
It's a broader question. We're talking about email, right? God help me, God forgive me. I archive a lot of my email, right? Because I think it's kind of interesting, right? You're engaged talking to other writers. It's as interesting as letters, right? But then I think, will anybody ever go to the giant AOL server, right? Which will be, someplace buried in the earth and say, let's open up that server and find all those.
The Oriental Institute's down the street, and the truth is that the vast majority of the ancient shards and hieroglyphics, no one's ever read.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's when I think of it. If we haven't gotten to stuff from Egypt
4,000 years ago, we're not getting to AOL archived emails.
Yeah,
No, I think I think that we're safe. I think we're safe in thinking that. Anyway, we do what we can. I feel that I've been there for a quarter century, and I think we're in better shape week to week now.
Do you have any projects you're doing now that you want to mention? Books that are in the pipe that we can look forward to?
I've been doing one of the pleasures of working both for the magazine and writing books is that the projects sort of sneak up on you in a certain way. And this book did. I suddenly woke up and said, boy, I write a lot about eating, don't I? There might be a book in that.
Well, that's something we talked about beforehand. I mean, do you feel constrained? When I saw this, I said, aha, Adam's getting back to France and his great theme, his great subject in life, and that he's neglected by looking at Lincoln and doing children's books and things. Do you resent that? Is that something which you feel?
Be honest, Neil. You thought Adam is that desperate to sell books?
No, I'm not absolutely not. Because it was your first book. I think it was where you really first connected with a larger audience, and then there was sort of expectation for the later books. Like, oh, he's not in France, and to me, I felt like we were sort of in the woods looking for themes.
Two things that I made. One is that I was consciously and I. All is an element of self-praise in this, I guess. That's sort of disgusting, but I will say it anyway. I consciously didn't want to stay in France for that very reason, because I realized that if I stayed any more in France, I could write well, but it would start becoming shtick.
You'd be the France guy.
You'd be the France guy. It'd be Paris to the moon, Paris to Mars, the moon and beyond. And before you knew it, you'd wake up and you'd be Peter Mailly, right? With My Life in Provence, the Provence cookbook,
Right, which is probably not a bad life to have.
And you'd make a lot of money, and you'd have that, but it would not be a writer's life. It would be something else.
People in France you meet in heaven.
Right, exactly. France is real.
Yes.
And so on. So I didn't want to do that at all, and I'm glad I didn't. I really am. At the same time, this book, as I say, sort of sneaked up on me from behind, because I had all this stuff about thinking about food. And similarly, coming back to your question, I sort of found myself in the last few years writing pieces, essays, about doing things that I never had done before and I thought I would never want to do.
Learning to draw.
Learning to draw, learning to take care of a dog, something. Right. I hated dogs, and the dog ended our life. Learning to, I'm doing one now about learning to play the piano. And none of this was sort of like a self-conscious effort.
It's not George Plimpton.
No, it was just these things were happening in life. And I thought, there's something interesting about that because, and forgive me, this is one of my editorials that I deliver to my kids' teachers when they get C's. There's nothing worse than having a writer in the class if you're a teacher, right? Because the writer, you can't shut up. One of the editorials I deliver is about the difference between accomplishment and achievement. We live in a society that's desperately driven by achievement. Right. Pass the next test, get to the next thing, get into the good college. It's kind of a fat envelope civilization, right? Your goal is to get that fat envelope from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, University of Chicago, wherever. And Achievement is very different, I think, from accomplishment. Accomplishment can be unuseful, but if you think about your own life, what mattered more, mastering guitar chords when you were 12 or learning algebra when you were 14? I think almost everybody's life is built out of the kind of confidence you get from a moment of unexpected mastery that requires a certain amount of perseverance and a certain amount of difficulty. So I wanted to write a book about accomplishment, about the ambiguities of accomplishment and how accomplishment differs from achievement and what the nature of that sort of mastery is. And so I think that'll be I did a long piece about magicians too, and learning about magicians. And magicians are wonderful in that way because the accomplishment they have, the mastery they have, is of absolutely no value in the world. Nobody wants it, basically. Nobody appreciates it, really, except other magicians. And you on your kid's birthday, right? And yet they have this immensely complicated, prideful, living civilization of magic, which is based simply on their inner knowledge of the difficulty of what they do and the glory of what they've mastered.
It takes a certain amount of confidence, because you're not going to be a great magician at this point. So
well, I can't even do it, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, how do you overcome? Most of us, we're trapped in the realm of what we're already doing because we're good at it. And the idea of going out and failing at something or risking failing at something, how do you take the embarrassment of doing something unwell enough to get good at it?
Well, I think embarrassment is a great subject. I mean, I think that's probably, it's a much more interesting subject than fulfillment, you know, the shelf of...
I wrote a book on failure. So
right, yeah, exactly. You know, the shelf of books on happy marriages is slimmer than the shelf of books on...
There haven't been any.
You know, I had The Secret of Life in this book, and in my last book, Angels and Ages, I had The Secret of a Happy Marriage, and nobody noticed it. You know how that is? You put on all these wonderful Oprah moments, right, hoping for the invitation to the royal court, and everybody says, oh, that highbrow writer. But I had The Secret of a Happy Marriage in Angels and Ages. You didn't even know.
I flew by, please. I must have absorbed.
It came up because that was a book about Charles Darwin and Abraham Lincoln and the birth of liberal rhetoric, and not liberal in the sense of voting Democratic, but of liberal in the broad political science sense. And one of the things that fascinated me was that Charles Darwin had an incredibly happy marriage with his wife Emma. It lasted a very long time. They had 10 children. They were devoted to each other. And they clearly had a very good sex life, as 10 children would suggest in 10 years. And I said, you know, what is it that makes a marriage a good marriage? It's a combination of lust, laughter, and loyalty. And those three things go on. But the trick is that it's canted down towards loyalty, a marriage. So every marriage of any duration at some point is a function, is an exercise in loyalty. But loyalty is not enough alone to fuel a marriage. And so we're always constantly trying to flip it back the other way towards lust. But
the men are.
Women too. They wanted women too. But the only way to do it, this is the secret, right? You could only do it through laughter, right? Because if you think about the way you got married, it was first there was lust, right? And then there was that wonderful moment of laughter when post-lust, very often, you realized you found the same things funny, right? You laughed at the same things. And then that generates into loyalty. The mistake people make is thinking you can go right back from lust, from loyalty to lust. But you have to pass through laughter.
That's what makes us Weisenheimers do well.
Yes, exactly.
On that note...
And wouldn't you think that Oprah would love that?
She would. Well, she's already gone now.
I know.
I did the Oprah show. It's overrated. Thank you. Was overrated. It's gone now. Thank you all for coming. They have to shoo us off stage for the next event. But Adam's going to be signing his book out front. And thank you, Adam. It was really a good